being outlaws is in our DNA. That's what it is to be American. We're always the rebel opposition. We're always outnumbered. We're always hated. We're also feared and respected. I wouldn't have things any other way. I'm having a good time.
All right, and we're live, gentlemen. Welcome back to the Greene Tavern. Tonight we have with us a special guest, Mr. Clossington. Would you like to introduce yourself, sir?
Sure, glad to. I go by Clossington online. I'm on the Old Glory Club's Central Committee. I represent the Mid-Atlantic region chapters from New Jersey and Pennsylvania to Ohio and Kentucky. I also have my own YouTube channel. I often post, I often have live streams such as the Nautical Chronicle, where I go over various nautical related topics. I'm kicking off tomorrow a live stream series reviewing the Sharps Rifles Napoleonic miniseries. But yeah, that's all I. Well, that's the start of what I do really. Occasionally, about once a year, I decide to write a sort of novella, a historical novella, detailing some sort of niche historical topic on Old Glory Club's Substack, which I'm due for, and the one that I'm cooking up has a lot to do with our topic for today. So I'm glad to be here, glad to represent the OGC, and thank you for having me on.
Fantastic. It's great to have you on, Mr. Clossington. As always, I'm your host, J.H. Rhodes, joined by my producer, Mr. Kevin, and our ghost. How are y'all doing tonight, gentlemen?
Good. Thanks for having me.
All right, and before we get into it, I just wanted to give a quick plug to the Carolina Men's Forum coming up on March 10th. It's a Tuesday night. That'll be just south of Raleigh. The link for it's in the chat of the stream. It'll be in the description as well. So the premier event for patriots in the state of North Carolina. We'll have a lot of great networking together, some speeches. We'll have a lot of friends out there, a lot of NGS members. great time. William Wolf, Stephen Wolf, and our headliner for the event will be Andrew Isker. So we look forward to seeing you all out there. All right. Without further ado, Mr. Clossington, you want to take it away?
So I think it was was it 3 weeks ago, maybe a month ago, you guys approached me about like what kind of sort of niche historical topic I could go over, right? And one of the sort of niche topics that I'm somewhat familiar with is the sort of it's the so-called U.S. New Navy from roughly 1882 to World War One, and that's sort of a nebulous period, but it's a period where you have all sorts of, I guess, interesting technological changes. I guess overall societal changes in America, and you end up with some of the funkiest, most experimental designs in naval history that I think that I personally appreciate as a skill modeler, but I also appreciate as a, you know, an appreciator of niche American subjects. Um, you have all sorts of tales of brave men fighting, pirates and bandits and rogue juntas and tin pot strongmen and the story of America really reclaiming its seat at the table in terms of international diplomacy, uh, particularly in some of the Teddy Roosevelt administration stories that I'll later get onto. But that's the sort of, I guess, that's the that was the initial pitch, and the story of American gunboat diplomacy, like it's very tricky to, I guess, describe the tale without getting into the sort of macro history of naval technological changes in the 19th century and the overall history of the U.S. Navy as a whole. So, guys, I have to ask you, when it comes to American gunboat diplomacy in the 1800s, like what immediately comes to mind, if anything, really?
For me, it's definitely the Great White Fleet, and then just sort of that action with Teddy Roosevelt and sailing around the world, that type of thing.
Yeah, I typically go back a little bit further to Commodore Perry opening up Japan in the 1850s. Just showing up with an American fleet and ending hundreds of years of isolation in a random, at that point, backwater country, just because we can, because we're Americans.
Yeah, Kev? Oh,
Yeah, you got me on this one. I really don't have I really don't know much about this subject, to be honest, man.
like like Hazard's Ghost mentioned, Japan, but did you know we tried to pry open Korea in the 1870s, but it was a total failure?
No, I did not know that. I guess on a meta level too, I remember seeing some Twitter posts basically arguing that the 19th century, from like say 1789 until about this time period that we're talking about, 1880s, the United States was focused on building a land empire. But then in the late 1800s through World War II, you really have just this transition to becoming a sea power across the globe, kind of almost inheriting, taking Britain's crown as ruling the waves there. And this is sort of kind of a critical transition period in history. That might be a little too meta for what we're talking about, but
Well, I mean, that's exactly what I'm talking about, and I won't say that we didn't have like any aspirations, um, would you mind if I share my screen real quick?
sure.
All right, let's pull this up. So the overall U.S. Navy as a whole, right? So everybody knows, how did the U.S. start? Well, a bunch of Barbary pirates from Tripoli started hijacking our sailors
Yep, for sure.
and ransoming them off. So what did we do? We created the first naval program featuring six heavy frigates. USS Constitution being, you know, the first of our the most famous of the original fleet. And then after we dealt with the pirates, we kind of put, Thomas Jefferson almost put the entire Navy program on ice in favor of small, Coast Guard defense, you know, defense ships to crack down on like smuggling. But after the War of 1812, it kind of lit a fire under our butts, where Congress essentially said, "Hey, if we're going to contend with the great power, with the crowned heads of Europe, we actually need to invest in a naval program." And like we had a few decent ships of the line. Um, so I should preface this real quick. So on the left, you have what's called a heavy frigate. So a frigate or a cruiser is, a rather large ship that is expected to cruise around the globe and protect, protect various merchants from pirates, and to sail around and do whatever it needs to do to make sure that America is safe. But it's also mobile enough um, to do whatever it needs to do quickly. On the other hand, ships of the line are expected to deal with you know, knockout, drag out fights with other ships of the line. Um, the old the old sort of strategy of ships of the line is that whenever you have a big navy, uh, the front and the back of the ship is kind of vulnerable, because if you got hit from the front or the back, the cannonball goes right through all of the decks and causes a whole bunch of damage. So the best strategy was to line all of your ships up tightly and to, broadside the enemy with as many cannons as possible.
Yeah, didn't you
The
have different rates as well? Like, you got first rate ships of the line, which were like over 100 guns, if I'm not mistaken. Um,
Yes. So yeah, the rating system mostly comes out of the Napoleonic era, and it's kind of anachronistically, presupposed to a lot of the older ships. Um, but yeah, the first rates usually had more than 100 cannons, and third rates usually like 70 some cannons. The U.S. after the War of 1812 ordered 9 ships of the line and 12 frigates, seeing that, hey, we just fought off Britain, the biggest naval power on the globe. We need to actually have um, some sort of fighting force um, after this big conflict. The original ethos of the heavy frigates, like the USS Constitution, was, hey, um, we aren't going to invest in many frigates, but the ones that we will have on the field will be absolutely able to body whatever the Brits have to field. So all of the main cannons are going to be 32-pound cannons, and then cannonades, or naval shotguns at the deck. So a lot of the US's early ships are sort of top heavy and overgunned, and that's the exact ethos that we applied to our ships of the line, like USS Pennsylvania. We said, why do we bother with having 32 pounders at the bottom, 24 pounders at the middle, and long guns like 12 pounders at the top? Screw it. Let's throw caution to the wind and just put 32 pounders on everything. And it makes supply easier, but at the same time, the higher heavy guns are on the deck, the less stable it becomes. But and right after Congress actually initially ordered all these ships, what happened was, we didn't have a war for 30 years, and most of these ships kind of like languished on the stocks for 20 years or so. Like, it took Pennsylvania about, uh was that 19 or 16 years to actually be built. We really didn't have much of a need for ships of the line. We didn't have any big wars, so most of the time we just sent out the small cruiser or the small frigates like Constitution or Constellation or whatever out. So we didn't actually use these. We ordered between the War of 1812 and the Civil War about 20 ships of the line. Only about 10 got built, and the 10 that did get built, you know, only one was used in the War of 18, or only one was used in the Mexican-American War, and it was kind of outdated by that point because between the War of 1812 and the Civil War, there was a revolution where all of a sudden you had steamships. I have the USS Mississippi on the left and Merrimack on the right, but the idea was wind is unpredictable. Steam, you can constantly have a source of propulsion that did not rely on the wind. And if you slapped a bunch of heavy guns on them, you could go anywhere and do anything as needed without relying on the wind, and you could outmaneuver whatever opponent you had, even if it outgunned you, you could still outmaneuver it. The USS Mississippi was one of the first of our steamships. It had side paddles or like paddle wheels. These were eventually phased out in favor of screw propellers like the Merrimacs over here. In typical American fashion, the Merrimacs were both, top heavy and extremely heavily armed, as well as fast, and so that caused a big headache for the for the Navy of the UK. And I don't want to dwell too much on this early Navy affair, but there are quite a few big sort of highlights that I just want to sort of rattle off. So we had the first Barbary War where we straightened out the Tripoli pirates. It we had to go back to deal with Algiers, and we did so pretty well. Had to deal with the Argentinians who were quite they didn't appreciate us clubbing seals on their own shores and within their borders, so they didn't do too swell to our folks, so we had to strain them out. Let's see. We had to invade the Indonesian island of Sumatra twice because the local pirates kept harassing our pepper merchants. We hanged in the very first mutiny aboard a U.S. naval ship, the son of the Secretary of War, his name by the name of what was it called? His name was Philip Spencer. He was the son of Secretary of War John Spencer. Secretary of War's delinquent son decided to play pirate and try to mutiny aboard a ship full of orphans and street bums, and ended up getting hanged. We also had a few of our miscellaneous first gunboat diplomacy episodes on this list, not including the Princeton affair. You guys all know John C. Calhoun, right?
Yes, yeah, the very
Yeah,
influential congressman.
Well, do you know how he got his very first cabinet seat?
How?
So what happened was we were showing off this brand new gun, the Peacemaker. It was a breech-loaded cannon aboard the USS Princeton, and wouldn't you know it, the cannon backfired and blew up the Secretary of State and the Secretary of the Navy, as well as half a dozen other people.
Jeez.
And that's number 2 in line for Secretary of State was Calhoun under Tyler. So that's how he got his Secretary of State position.
True meritocracy right there.
Yes. And then I guess I have. Yeah. Go ahead.
No, sorry, just next man up.
Yep. So that's how that happened. And the next, I guess, 5 little bullet points are just sort of miscellaneous gunboat diplomacy episodes. Personally, I'm cooking up a larger Substack article on shenanigans in how the U.S. got Hawaii. It's going to be called Putches in Paradise, but Hawaii's a strange creature that we've had, a very strange relationship with over the years. Yeah.
So, the U.S. is engaging in these early gunboat diplomacy affairs. What gunboat diplomacy operations are the rest of the world getting up to at the same time? Surely it's not just us punishing the Indonesians or the Hawaiians, etc.
Yeah. So in our own backyard, I have a very good book called Our Sister Republics by Caroline Fitz that goes over American diplomacy in Latin America. But what ends up happening in the disintegration of the Spanish Empire is that the UK ends up supporting all sorts of republics throughout Latin America and running guns and backing various. They turn out to be juntas, but in theory they're democratic movements. And throughout the early 19th century, you have all sorts of expeditions to essentially conquer the unclaimed areas of the world in order to establish colonial empires. And to do so, there's a sort of like technological arms race going on. Um, like I started alluding to the transition from sail to steam, but a lot of countries like the UK and France are in something of an arms race during this early portion. So the UK, like we all know, the war on drugs. The UK sides on the side of drugs in supplying in trying to break into the Qing Empire to set up new markets in China. But during the very first Opium War, you had what was called the Nemesis. It was a British East India Company steamboat that is able to obliterate, 20 like Qing junks in like a single sitting, a single battle. And this impresses naval observers so much that they start investing in like various state-funded naval projects for steam, ultimately culminating in a test run between screw powered like versus um, versus paddle wheel, Rattler versus Electo. Screw ends up winning over paddle wheel. We end up focusing on paddle wheel for the future. And then the French, yeah, sure.
Sorry, asking a question. So Robert Fulton made the first steamship in 1807. Why is it that it seems like it was much later when we start seeing these on actual warships, and specifically ocean-going warships?
Yes.
So I don't mean to jump in there. I was just curious.
So the early steamships, like so I actually have the very first steam powered warship ever in world history. It was actually American. It was the Demologos during the War of 1812. Our issue was that steam engines were so weak that they could barely fight against currents, and so the best use for them was as floating batteries. Like in the case of the Demologos in New York City Harbor, we basically strapped an engine and propeller onto this floating barge with a ton of heavy artillery pieces, and said that's enough to defend New York City. So yeah, at around the same time that Fulton is developing his first steamboats, we originally started strapping them onto slower but effective floating batteries, and the technology only got better from there. If that answers your question. During the War of 1812, we also used various steamboats to supply our army at Andy Jackson's army at the Battle of New Orleans. There's a very famous steamboat. Its name escapes me right now, but it steamed from Pittsburgh all the way down to New Orleans for the Battle of New Orleans. Right in time to supply Jackson's army. So this kind of stuff was originally was having an effect on the battlefield right out the gate.
Sure. I guess so. When was the first like true ocean-going steam-powered ship?
So that so that's kind of a question that's kind of up for debate. The Demologos was the first one that actually got actually used as a ship of war, and Americans can claim that. But strapping them onto miscellaneous boats, there were like half a dozen test cases that are kind of lost to history. But these are the ones that really made an impact as far as like big benchmarks. And the sort of real like head scratcher was the Napoleon, where they were like, let's take this 140 gun ship of the line and strap an engine onto it, and that caused a sort of, when the French did this, they caused sort of a scare within the UK media.
Sure.
And we thought for a few years that there would be a war between the UK and between Napoleon III and the UK again. But then guess what happens? They end up turning and fighting off the Ottomans, or I'm sorry, fighting off the Russians in the Crimean War. And all the latest tech gets used on them instead.
Gotcha.
But at the same time, we develop the Praxis gun, which is shooting shells that explode rather than cannonballs. We end up having in the Crimean War this floating battery called the Lave, which is very effective. And just after the Civil War, we end up with the Whitehead torpedo, which is the very first self-propelled torpedo.
Oh wow.
And to sort of put a sort of cap on this, we have to put a sort of cap on both the historical development and the history of the early U.S. Navy. We end up with the Monitor and the Merrimack and the Gloire and the Warrior. So the Monitor and the Merrimack kind of showed what the future would look like. It is two ironclads, extremely heavy, going at each other, can barely penetrate each other's armor. But which is going to actually win in history? Is it going to be the sort of low to the waterline with a barbette mounted turret, or is it going to be the broadside that is extremely heavily defensible but kind of slower? At the right before the Civil War, though, we end up with the very first like iron hold warships. They're sort of heavy frigates, Gloire and HMS Warrior. HMS Warrior is still around to this very day in Portsmouth.
Very, very cool.
Yeah. So right after the Civil War, the UK scratched its head and is like, which is the future, the Monitor or the Merrimack? So they decided to test both. They ended up with two different rival engineers. favoring two different designs. One being the sort of central battery based off of the CSS Virginia, called the Monarch. It looks sort of like a standard frigate, but it's entirely plated with iron and it's propelled with steam. And the other is the HMS Captain, which has two sort of armored turrets that look kind of like the Monitor. But do you see anything wrong with the Captain?
Yeah, it doesn't have great range of fire, like great traverse there. It looks like on the batteries. Maybe that's not what you're for, but that's what I see.
So the main issue with the Captain is that it's so low to the water. Like, as soon as it fires a shot, it's dipping the hull into the water, and it can't withstand any sort of
seas or anything, or
any sort of rough seas.
Yeah.
And so on its very first maiden voyage, wouldn't you know it, the thing, hits a storm and just about everybody on the ship dies. It's very horrific. And it's the HMS Captain is known for being one of the worst designed ships in naval history for this reason. Just such a low freeboard and such a loss of life. It was very unfortunate. And so for the 1820s, most ships ended up looking like the Monarch until we could really nail down how to get a high freeboard and efficient engines without sacrificing seaworthiness. And so I have over here the sort of evolution of the UK's navy, which is like the top rate navy that we had that existed in the world. The very first ship that did not rely on sails whatsoever, the HMS Devastation. Very, very low freeboard, but it had big turret in the front, big turret in the back, just like the Captain. And then you ended up with the very first, it's called a pre-dreadnought battleship. One big turret in the back, one big turret in the front, and a bunch of miscellaneous guns strewn about the sides. And then you ended up with various upgrades to this very first pre-dreadnought battleship class, like the Centurion and Renown, the Majestic, until you end up with the full dreadnought battleship, the battleships that we know today, which said, we don't need these tiny little guns along the side. All we need is big guns with advanced modern rangefinders that can fully sink an enemy ship. And during this time, of course, the French they had some of the most ugly, artistic aesthetic looking ships. Like this is the Charles Martel, or this is the French built Cesarevich that was handed over to the Russians. Meanwhile, the Japanese, they ordered all of their ships from the UK, so they kind of look like UK pre-dreadnoughts. This is the Mikasa, which is still around to this very day. The famed ship that defeated the Russians at the Battle of Tsushima Straits. The French, they had their ideas about, hey, if you had more space at the very bottom of the ship, you could actually raise the top of the ship a little bit more because the center of equilibrium or whatever evens out, and you could have higher turrets with better accuracy, but they weren't as seaworthy. So all of the French ideas, kind of shat the bed a little bit.
Can I jump in a question real quick?
Sure.
So it really seems like the dreadnought class battleships, and even going on to the big ones in World War II, like your Iowa class and that type of thing. Mm-hmm. It's really the final evolution of Trafalgar style naval engagements, right? Like we're going to have ship on ships, like just duking it out with their guns. Really sort of like the final, before we get to like carrier based naval warfare.
Yeah.
So like with that in mind, were there any, what are some big naval engagements where we have sort of almost like a something reminiscent of like a Nile or Trafalgar type engagement, but with these dreadnought or just pre dreadnought class battleships? Or is there anything that's sort of comparable to those big like Trafalgar like engagements?
So the best I have for you is the Battle of Lissa, which was in the I think it was like second or third Italian War of Unification, where you ended up with, highlighted are all of the ironclads versus the not highlighted wooden warships. It was between Austria and Italy, and Austria had, less ironclads, but they had competent leadership, and they, they just like at Trafalgar, they crossed the Italian T, and through superior individual gunmanship, they were able to defeat the Italians in this sort of pivotal battle. But there were also a few like miscellaneous other battles. At the Battle of Lissa, one of the ironclads was mounted with a ram bow. It was able to sink an enemy, a Italian ship with a ram for the very first time in like 2,000 years.
That's crazy. Since Lepanto, probably, but
yeah, exactly. And then you ended up with like a war. There was a war in the Pacific between Chile and Peru and Bolivia over nitrate salt field rights. Then there's of course the first Sino-Japanese War.
That's a big one.
Yeah, so the Japanese, they're building a modern navy from scratch. So who do they look to? Do they look to the British or do they look to the French? On the face of it, the Brits seem to know what they're doing in terms of naval stuff, right? Because they're at the cutting edge. However, the French, the French had a little bit of a budget crisis because they couldn't outspend or out-industrialize the Brits. So the French had to get creative with experimental ships. And so they developed what was called the Jeune École, or new school of naval thinking, that said, we have explosive shells, we have torpedoes, we have new submarines. If you've ever seen 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, the Nautilus is based off of the French first submarine called the Plunger, or the Diver. So in the 1870s and 80s, the French invest a lot in torpedo boats, and in torpedoes and submarines, in experimental shell guns. They invest a lot into cutting edge tumble home battleship design that looks, very steampunk, but not very functional. But the thing is, what happened was the Japanese realized that, the Japanese did steamroll the Chinese battleships, but that was only because of Chinese incompetence, because the Chinese did not take care of their weapons, because they, didn't actually operate their battleships effectively. The Japanese rolled up with cruisers and torpedo boats, but only barely managed to defeat the Chinese. And so they realized, let's order a bunch of British ships instead. And then you ended up with the two big wars of the pre-dreadnought era, the Spanish-American War and the Russo-Japanese War, which brings us sort of back to, our American history. So we've sent out a bunch of like naval expeditions in the past. Like the dictator of Paraguay decides to like shell an American surveyor. So what do? We send a dozen gunships to their port and demand an apology. We break open, Japan with the USS Mississippi as its flagship. Um, you know, the British decide to take over the island of Hawaii, which is this neutral port. What do? We send in a few frigates to get them to de-escalate, and so on and so forth. During the Civil War, a few rogue Japanese lords decide to shell American ships. So we blast them with the USS Wyoming. And there's a massive buildup right after the Civil War where we went from like 100 ships in the U.S. Navy, only about 10 of like operational frigates, and like 10 steam-powered frigates, to about 600 ships. And we went from a U.S. naval budget of about in the 50s to 120 million in the Civil War, and then after the Civil War, we just stopped funding the Navy, and just kind of coasted off of what we had. But this kind of put us in hot water, not actually investing in the Navy, because uh, during one of Cuba's wars of independence, the Cuban 10 Years' War, an American smuggler ship, the Virginius, decides to smuggle arms to Cuba, and they get caught, and the Spanish authorities execute 53 Americans, but can't actually do anything because right in New York City, the Arapiles, which is an ironclad frigate that outclasses everything that we have in port, because 10 years of technology have advanced and we didn't invest anything in new stuff. So even if we wanted to fight the Spanish on this issue, they still outgun us. And then like in the 70s and 80s, the Argentinians and Chileans start, investing in big battleships that rival American battleships. And by 1883, the strongest battleship in the Western Hemisphere is owned by the Brazilians, of all people. And, you know, there's a thing to be said about being prudent in government spending, but it's kind of humiliating when the Brazilians have a bigger fleet than the United States. And so this sort of doldrums, this sort of lull point in the late 60s and 70s, ended with a massive revitalization program in the 80s and 90s, which is, what I mostly came on to talk about. But I've spent a good chunk in this digression. But it's very important to understand where everything was going. Yeah. So I guess, do you guys have any like questions or comments up to this point?
Yeah. So, what's driving naval advancement in this era? Is it just a lot of trial and error? Like, are we seeing a lot of weird technology show up on one-off ships, and then if it works, if it doesn't work, etc.
So there are all sorts of like private sector experimentation sort of things going on. Like constantly the railways are innovating on new types of engines. Constantly there are new types of like passenger transport ships. Throughout the era, like the British Navy is having their own like little experimental competitions between different contractors to see whose ship can do the best. So it is sort of like an international public and private competition. um, you know, what type of iron does best against cannonballs? Is it wrought iron, or is it rolled iron, or is it hammered iron? Is it steel? Like, can you actually manufacture steel to a certain like thickness? It's all both like public, private, and international. So all of this stuff is happening all at the same time. This is like a century of advancement. It's a very interesting sort of era when you look at who's doing what when, and seeing all of the mistakes along the way. So there's that. Anything else?
I think we're good to keep chugging along.
Yeah. So in 1882, William Hunt, the Secretary of the Navy under Chester Arthur, takes inventory of the state of the Navy and sees that it's completely unacceptable. So what he does is he lobbies Congress and says, "Hey, we need to actually start competing with, the Chileans, Argentinians, and Brazilians if we don't want to be like the laughing stock that can't protect U.S. citizens from like Cuban police. We don't want to be a laughing stock." So the very first ships that we produce are ABCD, Atlanta, Boston, and Chicago. There are three like protected cruisers, and Dolphin is like kind of a large gunboat. And they all start launching in 84. We really don't actually do much with them other than cruise them around various like American and European ports and some South American ports, just to show off that we still got it. I also want to say that among the ideas that did not work, dynamite launching cruisers, cool in concept, but I don't think it's very functional.
Dynamite launching. Are you talking like a big mortar launching dynamite sticks? That sounds
Yeah,
like a
that's
fantastic
exactly what
idea.
it is. But the problem is range, though. The Vesuvius, if you're trying to get rid of like a fort that's like near a river, maybe, but it's it didn't work out too well. And the whole point of the ABCD ships is to jumpstart the American military industrial complex. Actually have like steel manufacturers that know how to build ships, know how to like acquire the right type of steel, like know how to build the right engines and stuff like that. Um, I have 2 volumes of it's a book. There are two books called The Shipbuilding Business by Facet. Um, they're books by various Cornell professors on the American economics of building ships throughout history, and it really gets into the sort of contracting end of things. And there were a lot of sort of crude, I guess, early attempts at how do you ship steel from Oregon all the way to New York City for a shipbuilder to build, like how does like a shipbuilder in New York City build a ship from scratch, stuff like that. And these first ships are cruisers. They're small. They're not nearly as big as like dreadnoughts, and it's still in line with the old American ethos that we really don't need battleships to go out and do war because that's not really our thing. We just need a sort of coastal defense or commerce raiding sort of force. Um, but we also have ships like the Olympia that hold to the old you know strap a shotgun to a raft kind of approach to design. If we're going to build a cruiser, it's going to be a cruiser plus bigger guns than any other cruiser that could possibly come up against. Um, but then a few different things happen. The first is Alfred Thayer Mahan's book, "The Influence of Sea Power Upon History." Have any of you guys actually read that book? It's kind of short.
I have it on my shelf behind me. I have not cracked it yet. but my understanding is this is probably one of the most consequential books ever written.
So it had two big fanboys. So Sea Power, it's essentially like a bunch of college lectures. The first chapter is a sort of uh, theory building, sort of like what is naval power, what is the function of a navy, and how does a navy actually what kind of what use is a navy to a power. And the rest of the chapter, and Mahan basically says a few things. He says that commerce raiding, privateering and raiding convoys has never won a war for about 200 years. And he has, 20 chapters of lectures on, you know, the 1660s and then the 1670s and then 1690s and then then the 1710s. And each time it sort of reinforces his thesis that only concentrated naval power from one big battleship fleet that is able to knock out the enemy, establish naval supremacy, knock out their ports, and allow your guys to do whatever they need to do to win the day, ultimately ends up winning the war. And not just like tic tac, like we're gonna send Olympia to raid a convoy. Mahan says that in an actual war setting, um, no, the the side with convoys is going to set up a bunch of cruisers and organize armed convoys and defeat your sporadic raider. What really matters is establishing sea power. And by the way, any global power that wishes to be an empire, it relies on international trade in a system of essentially economic like modifiers that multiply the productivity of your economic base of operations. Um, like he infamously says, like in his first chapter, like the sort of Secretary of State of Louis the 14th, like Louis the 14th of France, looks upon these farmlands and says, "Oh, what a wealthy country is France," because of how like naturally beautiful his country is. But in reality, his country is being blockaded, and they're actually quite poor right now. And it's the irony that you can have a very rich country in terms of resources naturally, but until you have a naval merchant marine to convert natural wealth into actual military power, and if you can back up that military power with a strong navy, unless you can secure those things, you're just an idiot in a field with untapped resources. So Mahan becomes this sort of public intellectual. Like he gives all sorts of college like like speeches saying we need to have a big gun fleet in the U.S. And he also points out that um, in Central America we have the Panama Canal that's coming into place. Um, and well, two things: we have the Panama Canal and we have steam power. And the thing about steam power is that, in theory, ages ago, during like the War of 1812, it was very, very difficult for Europeans to invade the U.S. because of the big ocean. But now that we have steamships, the ocean is very, very easy to cross. And we also have now, you know, the French were digging this Panama Canal that is all of a sudden going to be the biggest international highway in the globe. Um, and we are going to have one fleet in Virginia and one fleet in San Francisco. And unless you can have enough sort of military power to back up your perimeter of influence and secure this lane, we're going to be just like the French at Trafalgar, with potentially a European power on our neck, like right in the middle of us, cutting us off and forcing us to have to like go all the way around South America to deal with one side or the other. So
It'd be
yeah,
very reminiscent of what ended up actually happening to the Russians with their in their war with Japan.
yeah, that well, Russians and the Spanish later on, having to deal with these like forces all the way across the globe. So what happens is the U.S. starts investing in battleships, and like they are quite ugly. Let's like hold our peace for a second. Um, the first two battleships that the U.S. produces are the Texas, aka Old Hoodoo, and the Maine. They aren't actually given the battleship designation because of how small they are, but they're more just experiments to see if our industry can actually put them together. The Maine, which will become important in the Spanish American War, its turrets are actually kind of diagonal in a very strange placement. And the Texas, its turrets are like right next to each other in the front. So who knows what kind of stability issues they were going to have. They weren't meant to be offensive. They were meant to be more defensive, anyways. So they were more of like seeing what America could actually do. But the very first battleship was the Indiana. And do you notice anything that could potentially be wrong with the Indiana?
Looks very top heavy.
That's actually exactly what it is. It ends up being like one of the worst performing battleship classes in American history. The Indiana class is top heavy. You fire off a round, and you're dipping into the ocean on the other side. But we start actually charting these out in the early 1890s, and like before I get into like what we start doing, I should probably break down exactly what kind of ships we have. Um, like the biggest top dogs of the various fleets of the world are the battleships, right? They're the big guns, usually 12-inch or 14-inch, you know, turrets, like two turrets, fore and aft, and they're big, they're scary, you know. Usually they're more for coastal defense than just going on the offensive. Below the battleships, though, there were armed cruisers. So essentially, the sides and the area above the engines are plated with extra armor, uh, like the USS New York over here. Um, I kind of mentioned like the Olympia earlier, which is still actually floating in Philadelphia Harbor today. Basically, all of its armored protection is inside above the engine, but they make up for its lack of armor with how fast they are, and how quickly they can actually like respond to various international diplomatic incidents. Um, so the bulk of like your offensive fleet is going to be battleships and these two different types of cruisers. Um, Below the protected cruisers are the unprotected cruisers. They're kind of small. Oh, I should say, forgot to say Dolphin over here. But this was one of the original ABCD ships, the Dolphin. It's got a tiny little gun at the front of it. Isn't it kind of cute? It's not very armored, but it's
That looks like the size of a saluting gun.
yeah, it's well. This is what you want to patrol your bandit-ridden, Chinese rivers with. It's a big pop gun with, you're not dealing with enemy cannons. You're just dealing with civilian issues. Um, but below the unprotected cruisers are the very first destroyers. Um, Destroyers and torpedo boats. So, like I said kind of earlier, torpedoes started becoming a thing in the 1860s. And what do you do with a torpedo? How do you actually use that offensively? You have a torpedo that can blow a hole into a giant battleship. So the idea is you take a tiny little yacht and then you strap 2 torpedo launchers onto it. And you've got a little speedboat, so you can probably outrun the battleship. So you get in real quick and you blow it up with a torpedo, and then you get out before anyone can notice. Like this is the little USS Cushing, our very first torpedo boat. But the fact that we had torpedo boats, and there actually used to be torpedo boat carriers called motherships, whose job was just to like carry these tiny things. So to deal with the torpedo boats, like potentially swarming battleships and knocking out expensive battleships with tiny torpedoes, we had torpedo boat destroyers, which are about as fast as torpedo boats, but armed with like tiny little pop guns to punch a hole in the boats before they can get to the battleship. But the thing is, torpedo boats are about the same speed as torpedo boat destroyers, so torpedo boat destroyers end up becoming torpedo boats themselves, and they kind of meld into the same thing eventually. So that's how you end up with battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. Like as far as like naval designations go, in 2026 though, the Japanese destroyers can launch F-16s. So like designations are kind of gone right now, but back then this is what they had. Um, any questions on like what these kind of looked like back then, or how they actually functioned?
So how would a fleet ideally operate at this time?
So um, so this sort of gets on to, I guess, the very very first wars that we actually had with the new navy. Um, so so essentially we still ran lines of uh, we still used sort of like lines of battle, except instead of having HMS Victory at the front of the line, you had battleships in the line. Or in the case of the Battle of Manila Bay, you had the USS Olympia at the front of the line. And this starts to get into like what the U.S. did during this time. Um, so in the sort of doldrums, while we were figuring out like, hey, how do we have this like iron hold modern cruiser navy? We had various beefs across the Pacific. Um, so you guys have seen Master and Commander, right?
Fantastic movie.
Of course, yeah,
So
it's awesome.
so the the original um, the original ship that the Surprise is chasing, it was actually an American warship. In real life, it was called the USS Essex, aka Whaler's Bane. It was a U.S. Frigate whose job was to roam the South Pacific and attack whalers, just like in Master and Commander. Um, and Essex, decided to play Kingmaker, and the Pacific is quite a large place, right? And in order to actually have ships operating in the Pacific as whalers or as like navy ships, you need supply stations for friendly ports with supplies and water and what have you. And the U.S., we have a new navy now, so let's set up a base in Nukuhiva. But the problem is, as soon as the Essex, the bad guy and Master and Commander, shows up to Nukuhiva, he sees two different warring tribes, one fighting the other. So the Americans on the Essex decide to play Kingmaker and aid one tribe in the Civil War and overturn the other. We establish like a little American base, and then they eventually abandoned the base. But that was our very first sort of our very first instance of trying to set up like friendly relations with natives in the Pacific. Um, but after the American Civil War, right, we start looking for various Pacific islands to establish coaling stations. We like our engines have gone a lot better, but they are not great. They still need if you're sailing across the Pacific one from one side to the other to get to Japan or China, you still need to stop in the middle to get more coal. And so we look for a few different places. One of the places that we look to is Samoa. However, Germany is already eyeing up Samoa for as a coaling station, and we start kicking off a little bit of a diplomatic tussle over whose backed tribes of Samoa run the island and will give Americans or Germans, I guess, diplomatic diplomatic was it I guess better diplomatic rights to set up various plantations and harbors and whatever. Um, in the 1870s, a hurricane hits, and three American ships and three German ships end up wrecking, and one British ship that decided to weather the storm outside of the island survived. It was called the Apia cyclone. Uh, for all that are keeping tabs on this thing. We also tried to set up friendly relations with Hawaii, which ends up being a sort of um, how do you say? We have a long tussle with the British and the French over over who ends up owning Hawaii. Um, like, out of curiosity, how much do you guys actually know about how we got Hawaii?
I've heard about the intrigues with like the kingdom and like the, if I'm not mistaken, American like coup to put like an oligarchy in, but I
Yeah,
haven't read too much into it.
yeah, that's actually that gets the general points pretty correct. Um, I have a book on hand called "A Military History of Sovereign Hawaii" by Dukas. Um, it's essentially it's on how well did the Hawaiian Kingdom do in terms of military matters throughout its existence. Um, the island chain of Hawaii was unified by King Kamehameha the First in like the 1790s, and um, he was a strong man essentially. He was like the one chief that was able to conquer all of the islands with assistance from Westerners, Western guns, Western cannons, Western ships, and uh, you know, 30 years later, Kamehameha First's like army of like 40,000 warriors dwindles to about 94 guys who are essentially jailers, and they don't really do much. They're not really an army. There really isn't an army by the 1840s. And the Hawaiians, their diplomatic military strategy is to be as open doors as possible. They allow in the Americans, the British, the French. Everybody can do business here, but if someone oversteps their bounds, they cry foul to the other powers and have the other powers intervene on their behalf. And there are about a half dozen times where, like, the local chiefs don't acknowledge various land claims, and so the French steal the king's yacht and pot it off for money as recompense, or like the British briefly take over Hawaii for like 5 months because a chief refuses to let a British merchant build a wharf or whatever, violated like contracts or whatever. That is how Hawaii kind of survived, by being so friendly to everybody that they didn't really offend anyone, and everybody sort of went to bat for them whenever there was a slight against them. However, eventually, so many American sugar planters set up shop, and instead of having a formal military, the king, the sort of Merry King, I forget what his name was. It was like the Merry King who reintroduced hula dancing to the islands. He started letting um, local whites create their own like little militias, in hopes that, like, if there were any riots, that the militias would band together and put down the riots. However, it backfired, and the white Honolulu Rifles ended up cooing him, and you know, and then a few years later, when uh, the future queen um, tried to overthrow the bayonet constitution, the sort of American planters couped her, and the American Navy kind of just sat back and watched it happen. But that is like 150 years of like shenanigans, very very tightly condensed into a few minutes. But the TLDR is that American sugar planters cooed the Hawaiian monarchy and then begged America to admit them into the Union. Um, and the was it like the Cleveland administration said no, that's unethical. And then the Spanish American War kicked off, and McKinley needed a coal base between the uh, the West Coast and the Philippines. So what do you know? They wanted annexation, so we annexed them. That's how we ended up with Hawaii. Um, in terms of the Spanish American War, everybody has heard the destruction of the USS Maine in uh, in Havana Harbor. So what happened to the USS Maine? Um, so Cuba had been dealing with all sorts of like independence revolutionaries for you know for essentially 60 years through various like wars and what have you. Um, and Americans started investing in various plantations down in Cuba, and the treatment of the locals was somewhat abhorrent. So, to protect U.S. interests, we sent down like a few warships here, a few warships there, like the USS Maine. Like, if we're gonna have a sacrificial lamb, let's just send like the ugly lopsided duckling down there to make sure that things are okay. And then mine goes off, or there's some sort of spontaneous combustion in the coal chain, in the coal um, the coal storage area. USS Maine blows up. We end up going to war with Spain, and there are two major military battles in the Spanish-American War in 1798. The first, before they even knew what was going on, we sent our Asiatic squadron located in Hong Kong, flagship USS Olympia, Admiral Dewey. We sent them in to take over the Spanish-held territory in the Philippines. This actually is probably the one of the most iconic sort of naval battles in I guess American 19th century history, where like I said earlier about how the Spanish were, well, how in the 1870s, what was I gonna say? A lot of shipbuilder, or after the competition between the monarch and the captain clearly won out in terms of overall seaworthiness design. So what the Spanish did was they invested in a ton of these central battery frigates. And this is what the Americans were up against in the Battle of Manila Bay when we conquered the Philippines. A bunch of aging sort of relics from, from 20 years of from 20 years ago. Although the U.S. was numerically outnumbered, we still defeated them very, very easily. And then there was the Battle of Santiago de Cuba, where we defeated Spanish cruisers there actually were in Cuba very, very easily. But oh, it was a fairly easy business rolling up the Spanish.
I think it'd be worth kind of going into a little bit more detail of the Battle of Manila Bay. George Dewey's triumph, really one of the greatest victories of the United States Navy, and also one of the most underappreciated.
So what we did was very, very early in the morning, we rolled up in single file line, and we took pot shots at the Spanish fleet, which was conveniently out of range of their forts batteries. And then we turned around and we slugged them again. And they were very old ships, and they were outgunned, and we gave them hell. And a lot of Dewey's soldiers or sailors kind of clapped and cheered that we were beating them so thoroughly, but Dewey, reined him in and said, you can't. He sort of reined them in and said that you can't. Well, a bunch of sailors were dying here. We can't just we can't be too triumphalist about this sort of thing. So I don't have any. I don't have the actual plans for it up right now. So I can't really go and do a little play by play. I do have a recommendation though. There's a book that I have right in front of me called USS Olympia: Herald of Empire by Cooling, on the actual design, construction, and the battle that the Olympia played, being the flagship of the U.S. fleet. So I do have that source for you guys to read if you're interested. So so with the wrap up of the Spanish-American War, we've taken the Philippines, we took Cuba, we took Puerto Rico, we took Guam. We ended up having with Teddy Roosevelt, we end up having this massive expansion of the U.S. Navy. We go from like the somewhat like low freeboard, not very good Indiana class, the very first Iowa class, Kearsarge class, which, you know, double decker turret, kind of cool, kind of impracticable. Illinois class, Maine class, Virginia class. We Connecticut class is probably the peak of our pre-dreadnought era design. It's very, very close to what we have to like modern day battleships. And then we have the post dreadnought battleships, which are just all big gun. These are the heavy hitters that we end up using in World War One. The most notably like the South Carolina class and New York class, and eventually we end up with Nevada class, which is sort of what you'd recognize from like World War One almost, or World War Two almost, just a little bit less streamlined. But we start really, I guess, we really start, I guess, advocating for ourselves in the international um, diplomatic arena, and to show off all of these brand new ships that we've built, the first like 7 classes. We decided to have a going around the world party to show off exactly what we've built. So Teddy Roosevelt, he thinks, hey, let's sort of stress test our Navy. Let's see if we have any sort of sailing problems or constructability issues, or issues actually operating these ships out at sea. And also let's like check in on these various ports, give them honors, and let them honor us back. Show how good of an ally or how deadly of an enemy that we could possibly be. So we end up sending 16 battleships in the Great White Fleet from New York all around the globe, and coming back. Have you guys heard anything about the various highlights of the Great White Fleet?
So I know they generally they followed a east to west direction, starting and ending in Norfolk, if I'm not mistaken. Making their various port calls, and they split on a few occasions, but then traveled with the whole fleet once they got past the Pacific. If I'm not mistaken. Yeah.
Yeah, they started in Norfolk, and they only really divided up once, like between China and the Philippines. A lot of there's a little bit of I guess a pushback against having the Great White Fleet, because what if we accidentally humiliate ourselves, or if something sinks, or if something bad happens, won't that be a stain? But everything actually ends up going very well. Sort of a boring pit stop to Trinidad. We make it around South America without any sort of issue whatsoever. The Pacific is glad to see us actually stopping by. Probably the most enthusiastic crowds that the Great White Fleet had were in Australia, of all places. They were extremely enthusiastic about seeing all these giant American warships. Japan, in theory, Japan would have resented us a good bit, but there's actually an incident where there was a like an arch with like a Japanese flag that like caught fire, and a bunch of American sailors put out the fire, and the Japanese were very happy with us for doing that. And they also, shouted "Banzai" and tossed up the admiral in the air, and they were actually very happy to embrace the Americans in Japan. But after celebrating in Japan for a while, about half the fleet went off to do sort of naval target testing drills, and the other half went to China. China was kind of embarrassed that only half of our ships showed up, and we kind of lied to them and said that they kind of got lost in a typhoon. But their papers kind of played it up like we lost half our fleet in a typhoon rather than just they got blown off course. But they tried to save a little bit of face. But for the rest of the voyage, we actually stopped by Italy to help out with a volcano eruption as a sort of humanitarian mission. As a sort of humanitarian mission before finally getting back to the U.S. But yeah, that's it ended up being quite a sort of rousing success as far as the expedition went. But yeah, that's pretty much what it was. And by the time that we did get back, the announcement that the HMS Dreadnought, was rolling off the stocks was just coming in fresh hot off the presses. So the sort of outdated old pre-dreadnoughts were already outmoded by the time that they wrapped up the Great White Fleet. So what I sort of have for the rest of, I guess, the stream is the sort of list of like what we got up to in the sort of early banana wars of the early 1900s. But on top of this, I want to say that we was it called where do you think so Banana Republic, right? So the US is okay, so what is a Banana Republic? Do we have any like sort of like guesses or like what
Yeah,
do you think it actually connotates?
The original term comes from the United Fruit Company, if I'm not mistaken, and they're like various enterprises in Central America that were backed up by the U.S. Navy and the U.S. Marine Corps in particular. A lot of I don't know what the correct word is, but corporate control of those republics backed up by American force.
So the very very first Banana Republic was Costa Rica. What happened was Costa Rica is a tiny country. On the east is the Caribbean, on the west is the Pacific, and this one sort of family of eccentric American engineers, three brothers, the Keiths, decided to build a railway from the east to the west, and over this one mountain range that sort of disconnected the two coasts from each other and fully opened up development interior. Um, Two out of the three brothers ended up dying. Minor Cooper Keith into like the local aristocracy, and along the railway they had about 10 miles of right of way like offset from the railroad, and to feed their construction workers along the railway, they imported this sort of rare fruit from Panama called called the bananas, and they started planting bananas along the railway to feed their construction workers. And eventually, bananas became they became a staple among like construction workers and sort of working class Americans after uh, after the construction of this railway, and after a lot more of these countries started developing railways of their own. So you had infrastructure development as a sort of like, civic good initially, turning into the main supplier of jobs in any one area, being working on a banana plantation and the railways, shipping them out. So yeah, we do end up with like half a dozen different coups. Um, the United Fruit Company becomes like this sort of conglomerate that eats up all the other like banana like plantation companies and transportation companies. Um, in the 1880s through early 10s, it's sort of like the sort of like a honeymoon period where it's an it's a sort of undeniable good that these railways are building infrastructure, but at a certain extent, like towards the end, they just become these big extractive institutions that kind of run the government by proxy. Um, and so you end up with like American Marines in Nicaragua putting down like liberal rebels, for about 20 years, or Americans like taking control over like all of the Dominican Republic's like export custom houses, or cooing, or like the United Fruit Company cooing the government of Honduras in 1911. But that's sort of outside of what the Navy does. These are just the examples where the Navy does intervene. Um, you also had instances where all of these Marines had to be supported by naval assets that could evacuate them or provide bombardment from the shore. But you also had in um, in the Yangtze River, there was the Yangtze River Patrol, where American gunboats protected Standard Oil merchants that would ship kerosene into the Chinese interior, um, and protect these sort of oil suppliers with various gunboats. And there are all sorts of instances of violence breaking out, protecting against rebels, quashing different rebellions against the government. And that's all ramping up to World War One, where American the American military, its Navy and its Marines, end up quashing all sorts of um, a sort of opposition to American hegemony in the Western Hemisphere. Um, in the Western Hemisphere during World War One. But all of these banana wars and sort of like financial chicanery, dollar diplomacy, whatever, it all really starts in Venezuela in 1902, where essentially what happens is Venezuela is in a civil war in the late 1890s through 1900s, and their entire like tax collecting infrastructure is shot, and they can't pay off their international debts, and all sorts of European factories and infrastructure projects are destroyed, and in order to pay off these debts, the Venezuelans essentially say, we're not going to pay them. So Germany and the UK blockade, and Germany opens fire onto Venezuelan port. Um, what happens is, um, Teddy Roosevelt asserts the Monroe Doctrine with the Roosevelt corollary that we are to act as international police in the Western Hemisphere. That any sort of international trade mediation is going to be through the United States, rather than any sort of outside power. Um, and we essentially said, Germany, you guys have 24 hours before we're sending in the Navy to oust you guys from Venezuela. Um, and this shakes Germany into essentially complying with with complying with American mediation over the debt structuring for Venezuela. And starting with Venezuela, we end up with all of these other like banana wars up until like roughly the FDR administration, where we adopt a good neighbor policy, and we stop occupying like half of the Caribbean. But that's essentially where I leave you guys, and I think I've been speaking for a little bit more than I probably should. Um, but that's just about all I have for my presentation. I have a few anecdotes about the various banana republics and inventions, but outside of that, that's most of what I have for you guys.
Well, that's fantastic. Thank you for coming on, Mr. Clossington. This is a very much underappreciated era of American history, of American naval history in particular. It's good to shine some light on this. A lot of really cool stuff. Is there anything you'd like to shill or self-promote before we get out of here?
Of course. Tomorrow I'm hosting the very first of my Sharps TV series movie reviews on my channel. I go by the same name, Clossington, on YouTube, and I am having on Apostolic Majesty and Wandering Panda for the very first of these reviews, and I'll see you guys there.
All right. Well, thank you again for coming on. Gentlemen, it's been a great time, great stream. We'll see you all next Wednesday.
Thank you.